Yes, good afternoon. My name's Alistair Nicholson. I was to be with you today, and it's very unfortunate that I'm unable to be in Melbourne. I have a commitment in Brisbane that I was unable to break, involving the death of a close friend for whom I have to deliver a eulogy, so I hope you'll accept my apologies. I do, though, want to say a few things about today's discussion. We have a very interesting group of people here, particularly Rosalie Kunoth-Monks, who is an outstanding person, an Aboriginal person of considerable experience and skill, a leader of her community, and indeed a very well-known Australian figure. She, like many of us, is very concerned about the current government's proposals for lengthy leases of community areas, and I think it appropriate that she should be speaking to you about this today. Similarly, I have been in touch with the Reverend Djiniyini Gondarra, who has similar concerns, and he has put out public statements in this regard of considerable significance. The real problem that we have is the government's insistence on continuing the disastrous policies of its predecessors, particularly in relation to consultation, or lack of it, and particularly in failing to respect Aboriginal elders, Aboriginal leaders, and Aboriginal traditions as to consultation. We have the spectacle of Senator Scullion in his new role as Minister, operating on effectively a fly-in, fly-out basis, trying to produce instant agreements with Aboriginal communities, or with a few purported representatives of Aboriginal communities, and trying to conclude the whole thing in a very short time, talking in terms of a blitz around the territory to reach these agreements, and showing a complete insensitivity to the culture of those with whom he is dealing. Both Rosalie and Djiniyini have asked me to deal with particular questions for the purposes of giving this interview, and I'll do that now. Rosalie's first question is that government is asking some communities to agree to 99-year township leases, and she asks, what are the implications of signing a 99-year lease? Well, I suppose the first implication is that you're tying up the land for at least 4 or possibly 5 generations. You don't know what's going to happen in the interim period, and in fact, generally, in white society, a 99-year lease has come to be regarded as almost equivalent to free ownership of land. And indeed, all of Canberra's residential land is on 99-year leases, and I think people would be very surprised if they were told there that they might have some difficulty in renewing those leases at the end of that 99 years, which is still a long way off. So really, I think what's contemplated by government when it talks about a 99-year lease is an acquisition for all practical purposes of the land in question. The government is in effect behaving so much like its many predecessors, even going back, for example, to John Batman, where he was acquiring land for a few blankets and beads. This government is perhaps paying a bit more than that, but if you look at it in the long term, their behaviour is in the same category. And it seems to me that this is a really retrograde situation. Rosalie's next question is that the government states that the community will still own the land even though a 99-year lease has been signed, and asks me to explain that. Well, as a matter of law, that's strictly correct. You can lease land for very long periods and you are still the titular owner of the land. However, when you're leasing to government or government corporations for that sort of a period, you've also got to realise that the government can legislate to extend those leases if it wants to. And after all, you're looking virtually 100 years down the track. How much interest, how much culture is going to be preserved if that land's been removed from your people for that sort of period? And her third question is, how important to Aboriginal people are the protections in the Land Rights Act? Well, the answer to that is they're extremely important. Land rights was something for which a hard fight was fought and won. Legislation was passed by far more responsive governments than this one or its immediate predecessors. And the fact of the matter is that what is now being undertaken is, I believe, an exercise of sleight of hand for the purpose of acquiring valuable lands back into the hands of government to deal with as they wish. They, of course, say that this is for the benefit of Aboriginal people, but they're making the decision as to those benefits. It's not the Aboriginal people who are doing so, and that seems to me to be the essential flaw in their argument. The Human Rights Commission has laid out very important provisions for consultations with Indigenous people, which has been endorsed by two government inquiries, parliamentary inquiries, one of which Senator Scullion was a member, of which one Senator Scullion was a member. And the sort of consultations that they envisage is something far removed from the sort of exercise that's being conducted by this government. I'll turn now to Dr Gundara's questions. His first question is, under current legislation, we are able to support housing and business development in our towns. Why do you think government is asking communities to agree to 99-year leases? I have some difficulty in answering that, in the sense that I can't think of any legitimate reason why the government would want 99-year leases of the land in question. It seems to me that the only likely, or the most likely reason for the request is to have control of the land for 100 years and to do what it likes on the land for that period. And of course, as a lessee, rather as a lessor, once it's got control of the land, it can behave as if it's an owner. And if you can behave as if you're an owner for 100 years, you pretty well are an owner. The government may have perfectly what it thinks are legitimate reasons for doing that, but it seems to me that it's unanswerable to say that there's no reason why the Aboriginal people themselves, the traditional owners and the communities, should not be involved in that process. And yet this seems to be designed to cut them out of the process completely and place the control of the land in the hands of bureaucrats and businessmen, not necessarily from the Aboriginal community. I think that this is a proposal that should be strongly resisted, and that if communities do think it's appropriate at some stage to enter into some sort of a lease, it ought to be for a much lesser time, and it ought to contain very significant clauses enabling them to retain control over the use to which the land is put. And it's got to take place in a culturally appropriate way and over a considerable period, and with the government supplying independent legal and other advice to the Aboriginal communities before they're ever asked to enter into any sort of agreement. The second question from Dr Gundara is, how is our people have great difficulty in persuading government to negotiate with us in a culturally appropriate manner. That is, talking with the senior lawmen of our communities. Can you suggest ways in which this can be achieved? I think the only way this can be achieved, if it can be achieved, is for government and senior members of government, from the Prime Minister down, to take a good look at themselves and to take a good look at what they're trying to achieve and the best way to do it. I've already mentioned the consultation requirements of the Human Rights Commission. I also think it's important for government to realise that they're not just engaged in some horse trading exercise with a group of people who are fully across what the government is doing and are dealing with them as equals. The people that the government is dealing with in these circumstances are people with a traditional tie to the land, with a culture that goes back into history. It's not the sort of negotiation that should take place as it would between a developer and government or some other business or entity in government. It's a much more significant one than that, and as the government's proposing it for a much longer period. I really think that the answer to the question of Dr Gundara lies in the hands of government itself. And I think that unless and until it's prepared to negotiate in a culturally appropriate way and on an equal basis, providing time and plenty of opportunity for consideration and full consultation, then the negotiations should not proceed. And I would strongly urge Aboriginal communities to be very careful about entering into any such agreement that's entered into or sought to be entered into by a government in the way that Senator Scullion has been attempting to do it in the last and recent period. I think that this is a very important issue, and it's one that Aboriginal communities need to look at very carefully, and the government needs itself to come clean as to what it really proposes to do and why it needs leases of this period. Thank you.